before we begin, this is the second part of a series on the French and Indian War. So if you haven't already checked out part one, then I recommend you go and do that. Anyway, let's get straight into it. So it's now 1758, and things were looking pretty bad for the British the last time I checked. A whole bunch of forts that needed to be taken have failed to be taken, and the French seem to be one step ahead in almost all military encounters. So will 1758 be the year that changes everything for the British? Do you guys remember that British blockade of French ports in mainland France? Well, it's actually starting to be useful. Limited supplies were reaching North America from France now, because the British ships made life much harder for the French sailors, and this couldn't have come at a worse time for the French. There had also been a bad harvest in 1757, and this put a lot of strain on the supplies that the French army currently had. So the first action of the French in 1758 was to secure the defence of St. Lawrence, and this was done by resupplying some key forts on the way to it. But the British hadn't actually been idle either. The disappointing conduct of the war so far meant that a lot of people were losing their jobs. The British Prime Minister, the Duke of Newcastle, his military advisor, the Duke of Cumberland, and the Chief of British Armies in North America, Lord Loudoun, all lost their jobs. William Pitt was the new minister to dominate military planning, and the replacement for Lord Loudoun was James Abercrombie, who became the new Commander-in-Chief of British forces in America. So Pitt devised a new plan of action for 1758, where the key objectives were taking Fort Louisbourg, Fort Duquesne, and Fort Ticonderoga, which was known as Fort Carillon by the French. The first task for the British was to fully take Nova Scotia, and the fort that stood in the way of this was Louisbourg. The British besieged this, and after 48 days, it fell into their hands. 1 down, 2 to go. Further south, the Forbes expedition was launched. This was a British invasion into the Ohio country led by none other than, you guessed it, General Forbes. At the prospect of a large and well-coordinated invasion, the French decided to pull back. Do you remember that elusive fort, Fort Duquesne? Well, the French withdrew from the fort and let the British have it without a fight, because they knew that their position in the fort would be precarious. And Britain was now in control of the Ohio River Valley. The final objective was Fort Ticonderoga. The British operation was actually led by the Commander-in-Chief himself, James Abercrombie. He had a force of about 18,000 troops that were set on taking the French fort. But against all odds, he managed to be defeated by a force just under 5 times his size. So the force of 18,000 British troops was defeated and repulsed by about 3,600 French troops. And guess what? It cost Abercrombie his job. He was replaced by Geoffrey Amherst, who was the man who was responsible for taking Fort Louisbourg off the French. 1759 saw the British push further into French Canada. Amherst actually did a really good job, and he succeeded to take Fort Ticonderoga where his predecessor had failed. Soon after, Fort Niagara was taken, and the British also engaged a small force of French soldiers at the Battle of the Thousand Islands, where the much smaller French force put up a very spirited resistance, which surprised even the British troops, but eventually the French forces were almost all wiped out, and the few that remained sued for peace. But perhaps the most important event of 1759 was the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. British General James Wolfe attacked the French army near to Quebec City. The French did outnumber him slightly, but he was still able to defeat the force. And at the conclusion of the battle, Quebec City was handed over to the British. In 1760, the French attempted to retake Quebec City, and initially it went really well. The French won the Battle of Saint Foy and were able to start besieging Quebec City, but it was cut short by the appearance of British ships which could relieve the siege and sent the French into retreat. That same French army suffered another stroke of bad luck when the ships that were sent to resupply them were actually intercepted and defeated by another British navy. So now the French were significantly on the back foot. Back to Geoffrey Amherst, probably one of the most capable generals in this entire war. He organised an offensive to take Montreal and thus end the war in North America. 3 separate invasion forces were drawn up, numbering in total to about 18,000 soldiers. Several small forts were taken along the way, until the forces rejoined to surround the town of Montreal. There was mass desertion within the city, and many French Canadians surrendered their arms to the British soldiers. The French commanders were eventually, and reluctantly, forced to sign the Articles of Capitulation of Montreal on the 8th of September 1760. This concluded the British conquest of French Canada, and for the most part, the war in North America was over. The whole 7 Years' War ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. The French alliance was defeated. A choice was put before the French. Either they surrendered French Canada, or they surrendered the islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique in the West Indies. The French opted to surrender French Canada to the British, as they felt the lucrative Sugar Islands were more profitable and easy to defend. The British also gained Spanish Florida, as Spain had actually joined the war quite belatedly on the side of the French. But, in recompense, Spain received Louisiana off the French. But at the conferences, the French were actually the biggest losers. But, as many Brits will probably agree with me, it is impossible not to feel some slight satisfaction about it. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, it really does help a lot, and subscribe to stay up to date with content, and I will see you in the next one.